The air in the Chateau Rouge was thick with the smell of slow-cooked meat, expensive wine, and a quiet kind of money. It wasn't the loud, flashy sort of place. The wealth here was in the details, the heavy silverware that didn't clatter, the deep velvet of the chairs, the way the candlelight glowed softly on polished wood. In the very center of the room, under the grandest chandelier, sat a man who didn't seem to understand the quiet part. He was a large man, not just tall but broad, with a voice that seemed to come from deep in his chest and carried further than he probably knew. He held a glass of amber whiskey, the ice cubes long since melted, and he was holding court. At his table were 3 other people, 2 men and a woman, all in sharp, dark suits. They listened, nodding along to his stories, their laughter a little too quick, a little too loud. He was the sun in their little solar system, and they orbited him. He talked about deals, about properties, about a golf course he was buying. Every sentence was about winning, about value, about things that had a clear, high price tag. His eyes, small and a piercing blue, constantly scanned the room. He wasn't looking for friends. He was assessing. He noted the cut of a jacket at another table, the age of the wine being poured, the quiet confidence of the head waiter. He was adding up the world around him, and he liked the total he saw, mostly because he felt he was the most valuable item in it. Across the room, moving between the islands of white-clothed tables with a dancer's careful grace, was a waitress. Her name tag said Ilara. She was young, maybe in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple, tight bun that emphasized the tired lines at the corners of her eyes. Her uniform, a crisp white shirt and black skirt, was spotless. She carried a heavy tray of used dishes, her arms steady, her back straight. She moved like water, smooth, quiet, finding the path of least resistance. She had been doing this for hours, since before the dinner rush. Her feet ached in her sensible black shoes, and a faint buzz of tiredness hummed behind her temples. The restaurant's centerpiece, its true crown jewel, was the piano. It sat on a low, circular stage in the corner, a majestic, glossy black Steinway grand. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a sculpture. It seemed to drink in the dim light and glow from within. A velvet rope on a small brass stand cordoned off the area. A silent message, *, look, but don't touch, *. It was for the hired pianist. A slender man in a tuxedo who came at 8, played smooth jazz until 10, and then left. The rest of the time, it was a silent, beautiful statue. Ilara had noticed the piano on her first day. It called to her. It wasn't just its beauty, it was its silence. It felt like a held breath. Every time she passed it, her eyes would linger on the sleek curve of its side, the elegant gold lettering of its name. It had been so long, a lifetime ago. Tonight, the ache to touch it was sharper. It had been a difficult shift. One of the cooks had shouted at her over a mix-up with an order. A customer had snapped his fingers to get her attention, not once saying please or thank you. She felt invisible, or worse, like a piece of the furniture, something useful but not truly seen. The music in her head, the only thing that had ever made her feel truly real, felt buried under a mountain of clattering plates and shouted drink orders. As she passed the piano on her way back to the kitchen, the tray now empty, she paused. The dining room was in a lull. The main courses had been served, and the low murmur of conversation and the soft clink of cutlery filled the air. The tuxedoed pianist wasn't due for another hour. No one was looking at the corner dot. It was a small rebellion, a tiny, secret thing. She stepped just over the velvet rope, feeling a silly thrill of trespass. She set her empty tray down quietly on a nearby service stand. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at the closed lid of the piano, her reflection a blurry, tired ghost in its dark surface. Then, slowly, she reached out, not to open it, not to play, just to feel. Her fingertips, still damp from the dishwater in the kitchen, gently brushed the polished ebony surface. It was cool and impossibly smooth. A shiver went through her, a direct line from her fingertips to her heart. In her mind, a cascade of notes played a few bars of a Chopin prelude she had loved as a girl. The memory wasn't just sound, it was the feeling of the weight of the keys, the slight resistance, then the give, the vibration through the wood and into her bones. It was the smell of old paper and dust in her teacher's studio. It was safety. It was home. Her face, for just those few seconds, changed completely. The mask of polite, professional detachment melted away. The weariness vanished, replaced by a look of such profound longing and tenderness it was almost painful to see. A soft, sad smile touched her lips. She was a million miles away from the Chateau Rouge, lost in a private, beautiful world. That's when the voice cut through the air like a cleaver. "You, the girl." Elara jumped, her hand snapping back from the piano as if burned. The spell shattered. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. The large man at the center table was half turned in his chair, his finger pointing directly at her. His blue eyes were cold and sharp. "Yes, you," he continued, his voice loud enough that several nearby tables fell silent. The waitress, all the soft murmurs in the room died away. Every head turned. Elara felt the heat of 100 eyes on her skin. She froze, a deer in the brutal glare of headlights. The man took a slow sip of his whiskey, making them all wait. He looked her up and down, a dismissive flick of his gaze. "That instrument," he said, each word dropped like a stone into the quiet, "is a Steinway Model D. It is not a prop. It is not a decoration for the staff to paw at." A nervous titter came from one of his associates. Quickly stifled, he leaned forward, his voice dripping with a condescension so practiced it was almost artistic. "Do you have any idea what it's worth? More than you'll make slinging steaks and cocktails in 5 years. Probably 10. He shook his head slowly, a showman with a captive audience. "Your job is to carry plates. Its job is to make art. I suggest you stick to your lane and keep your hands to yourself. We wouldn't want any asterisk smudges asterisk." The final word was delivered with a nasty, exaggerated emphasis. The message was clear. She was the smudge. Her touch was contamination. A wave of pure humiliation crashed over Elara. It was so complete, so public, it felt like a physical blow. Her cheeks burned a furious, hot red. The tiredness, the quiet sadness from moments before, was vaporized, replaced by a scalding shame. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. She looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes, especially the cold blue ones still fixed on her eye. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice a thin, brittle thread of sound. "It won't happen again." She fumbled blindly behind her for her tray, her fingers clumsy. She grabbed it, clutched it to her chest like a shield, and hurried from the stage, ducking back under the velvet rope. As she all but ran towards the swinging doors of the kitchen, she heard it, the low, rumbling chuckle of the man, followed by the relieved, sycophantic laughter of his table. The sound chased her, nipping at her heels. Behind the kitchen doors, the world was noise and steam and fury. The head chef was yelling about a sauce. Pots clanged. But for Elara, it was all muffled, distant. She leaned against a cool stainless steel wall, the tray still clutched tightly. She took deep, shuddering breaths, trying to push the hot tears back behind her eyes. She wouldn't cry here. She couldn't. The kitchen manager, a harried-looking woman with a clipboard, rushed past. "Elara, table 7 needs their check. And there's a wine spill on 12. Move it." And just like that, she was back. The girl at the piano was gone, locked away. She was Elara the waitress again. She wiped her hands on her apron, straightened her shoulders, and pushed through the doors back into the dining room. Her face was once more a calm, blank mask. But inside, the echo of his words played on a loop, and the memory of the piano's cool, smooth surface under her fingertips felt like the ghost of a dream she was now forbidden to have. The rest of Elara's shift passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical movements. The sting of the man's words, the laughter of his table, it all clung to her like a bad smell. Every time she passed the piano, she kept her eyes locked straight ahead, as if looking at it might invite another public scolding. The glossy black surface seemed to accuse her now, a beautiful thing she had been told she was unworthy of. She focused on the work. She cleared plates, refilled water glasses, and presented desserts with a quiet enjoy. Her face was a calm, pleasant mask, but inside she was hollowed out. The little spark of herself, the part that remembered music and beauty, felt smothered. She was just a pair of hands, a pair of feet, a uniform. That's what he had seen. And that's what she had to be until she could clock out and disappear. The man at the center table, the one with the loud voice, seemed to grow even more buoyant after the incident. His laughter was louder, his stories more expansive. He ordered another bottle of very expensive red wine, waving his hand dismissively when the sommelier began the usual presentation. "Just pour it," he'd said, as if the ceremony was for smaller people. He was a king in his castle, and the whole restaurant was his domain. Elara avoided that side of the room completely, letting the other servers handle his table. She could still feel the weight of his gaze sometimes, a cold spot on her back as she worked. She just kept moving. The scheduled pianist, a thin, older man with kind eyes and a neat gray beard, arrived just before 8 o'clock. He gave Elara a small, Sympathetic nod as he passed her near the service station. He must have heard about it. The staff in a place like this talked quietly, quickly. Word of the public humiliation had traveled through the kitchen and among the waitstaff in hushed, angry whispers. The pianist's nod was a tiny gesture of solidarity, and it almost broke her composure. She managed a tight smile back and hurried away. He sat at the Steinway, ranged his sheet music, and began to play. It was soft, competent jazz, the kind of music that was meant to be in the background, to soothe and complement the clink of silverware, not to be truly listened to. It was a wall of polite sound, and it worked. The restaurant relaxed into its evening rhythm. Elara let the notes wash over her, feeling nothing. It was just more atmosphere, like the candlelight. Then, at around 9:30, things changed. The pianist finished a piece, then stood up. He walked over to the restaurant manager, a nervous man in a too-tight suit who was always patting his forehead with a handkerchief. They spoke in low, urgent tones. Elara, clearing a nearby table, saw the manager's face go pale. The pianist was gesturing to his own chest, his face pained. He shook the manager's hand apologically, then walked quickly towards the exit. One hand pressed to his sternum. The manager stood frozen for a second, looking at the majestic, silent piano as if it had just grown teeth. Then he scurried into the kitchen. When he came out a minute later, he was followed by the head chef, and they both had the same panicked look. Live music wasn't just a nice thing at the Chateau Rouge. It was in the brochure. It was what people paid a premium for. A silent corner meant disappointed customers, and disappointed customers might complain, or worse, not come back. Elara finished wiping down her table and headed back towards the kitchen. As she passed the manager and the chef, she heard their frantic, hissed conversation. "Call everyone on the list. There has to be someone." He said, "It's a heartburn, but it might be serious. He's gone to the urgent care. Even if he recovers quickly, he's out for the night. Can we put the stereo on? Some classical CD? And have Mrs. Van Doren complain it's recorded? You know she can tell. She'll ask where Giorgio is." The manager was practically wringing his hands. Elara slowed her steps. A strange, quiet feeling was rising in her chest, cutting through the numbness. It wasn't quite a thought yet. It was more like an instinct, a pull. She looked at the piano. It sat there, silent and waiting. The velvet rope seemed stupid now, a meaningless barrier. The instrument wasn't being used. It was just a piece of furniture again. She walked into the kitchen. The noise was a welcome blanket. She put her tray down and leaned against the counter, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. She thought of the man's voice. * Your job is to carry plates. * She thought of the manager's panic. She thought of the cool, smooth feel of the wood under her fingertips, and the music that lived inside her, locked away for so long. It was a crazy idea. The craziest. After what had happened, to even go near that piano again was asking for more trouble. She could be fired. She could be laughed out of the building. The man at the center table would have a field day. He'd probably make a speech. But then she thought about something else. She thought about the money. She needed this job, desperately. If the evening went badly because there was no music, if people left unhappy, the manager would be looking for someone to blame. Cuts might be made. Her name, as the waitress who'd caused a scene earlier, might be at the top of a list. This wasn't about showing off. This wasn't about revenge. This was about survival. And maybe, just maybe, it was about claiming back one tiny, small thing for herself. She took a deep breath, walked over to the small, rusty locker in the staff corridor, and pulled out her bag. Inside, folded neatly beneath her street clothes, was a simple black dress. It was old, a little worn at the hem, but it was clean and plain. She had kept it for, she didn't know what for, a someday that never came. She changed quickly in the small, smelly bathroom, stuffing her uniform into the bag. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror. The woman in the black dress looked different. Older, sadder, but somehow more real. She unpinned her hair from its tight bun and let it fall around her shoulders in dark waves, quickly running her fingers through it. When she walked back into the kitchen, the staff gaped at her. The busboy stopped stacking plates. The sous chef paused, his spoon in the air. She went straight to the manager, who was now on his phone, his voice pleading. "Just for an hour, please. I'll pay double." She waited until he hung up in despair. "Sir," she said, her voice quieter than she wanted it to be. He turned, distracted, not really seeing her at first. Then he registered the black dress. What is it? Why are you changed?" Your shift isn't over for I can play, she said. The words came out in a rush. The piano. I can play it. Just for tonight. To help. He stared at her as if she'd just spoken in a different language. His eyes went from her face to her hands, which were clasped tightly in front of her. He remembered the scene from earlier. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to a flicker of annoyed desperation. You don't be ridiculous. This isn't the time for jokes. It's not a joke, she said, forcing herself to hold his gaze. I can play. Let me try. You have no one else. He looked around the kitchen, at the staring staff, then back towards the dining room door, as if hoping a professional pianist would magically materialize. The silence from the other side of the door was a heavy, expensive silence. He was a man backed into a corner. Fine, he spat out, not meaning it at all. Fine, if you want to embarrass yourself and my restaurant further, go ahead. But if you drive one single customer away with asterisk nursery rhymes asterisk, you're finished here. You understand? She just nodded. She felt cold and hot all at once. He stormed past her, pushing through the swinging doors into the dining room. She heard his voice, artificially bright and loud. Ladies and gentlemen, a brief announcement. Our pianist, Giorgio, is unfortunately taken ill tonight, but we have a wonderful, impromptu treat for you. A special performance from one of our own. Please, give her your attention. His voice was full of false cheer and real terror. Elara closed her eyes for a second. She could hear the murmur of the crowd, a murmur of curiosity and mild annoyance. She could picture every face turning towards the empty piano stage. She could feel, like a physical force, the gaze of the man at the center table. This was it. A terrible, public mistake, or something else. She pushed the door open and walked out. The manager, standing by the piano, gestured at her with a stiff, furious arm. Every single person in the restaurant was watching her. She saw the other waitresses, frozen with trays in their hands. She saw the curious, upturned faces of the diners. And she saw, at the center table, the large man. He had put his whiskey glass down. He leaned back in his chair, a huge, slow, delighted smile spreading across his face. He whispered something to the woman next to him, who covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking with silent laughter. He was getting a show, a comedy act to cap off his evening. The waitress who didn't know her place, now trying to play the piano. This was going to be better than he'd hoped. Elara walked past them all. She didn't look at the manager. She didn't look at the customers. She walked straight to the piano, stepped over the velvet rope as if it wasn't there, and sat down on the polished bench. It felt familiar and strange all at once. The bench was at the wrong height. She adjusted it slightly, her movements slow, deliberate. The room was utterly silent now, waiting for the first wrong note, the first fumbling chord. She placed her hands in her lap. She looked at the keys. Black and white, a landscape she knew by heart, but hadn't walked in years. She took a deep, slow breath, shutting out the room, shutting out the pressure, shutting out the man's grinning face. The first few notes were soft, almost hesitant. They were simple, clear notes that wandered gently, like someone remembering a half-forgotten path in the woods. A ripple of muted, polite chatter started up again at a few tables. The man at the center table leaned over and said something to his guests. His voice a low rumble followed by their soft, expected chuckles. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes fixed on the woman at the piano with the smug satisfaction of a critic whose worst expectations were being met. Elara didn't hear them. The sound of the piano, the true sound of this piano, was vibrating up through her fingertips and into her bones. It had been so long since she'd felt a real instrument, one with weight and history and soul. The tinny electric keyboard she kept hidden under her bed at home was a ghost compared to this. This was alive. Her spine straightened almost imperceptibly. The slouch of the tired waitress fell away. Her shoulders, which had been hunched as if waiting for a blow, dropped and relaxed. Her hands, which had seemed so ordinary moments before, now hovered over the keys with a poised, confident grace that looked entirely new on her. The simple, wandering melody began to change. It deepened. The left hand joined in, not with the basic chords of a beginner, but with a rich, complex harmony that wrapped around the right hand's tune like dark velvet. The music began to swell, to breathe. It was no longer a tentative exploration. It was a statement. The scattered conversations in the room died, one by one. It wasn't a sudden silence, but a slow draining away of sound, as if the music was a sponge soaking up every other noise. A man lifting his wine glass paused, the rim an inch from his lips, and didn't move. A woman in the middle of a sentence to her husband simply stopped, her mouth slightly open, her eyes drifting towards the corner. The piece was now unmistakable. It was Chopin, not the easy, popular stuff, but one of the nocturnes, a piece of music that is all longing and moonlight and melancholy beauty. It was technically demanding, requiring a touch that could be both powerful and whisper soft, a control that could make a single note weep, and she had it. Her face was a mask of complete concentration, but it wasn't a tense concentration. It was the focus of someone who was finally, after a long and exhausting journey, doing the thing they were meant to do. Her eyes were half closed, not looking at the keys but seeing something inside the music. Her body moved with it, a slight sway from the waist, her head tilting as she leaned into a particularly tender phrase. The notes flowed like water, but water with a current so strong it could pull you under. They cascaded in runs that sparkled, then fell into deep, resonant chords that seemed to shake the crystal glasses on the tables. The dynamics were breathtaking, a passage so quiet the whole room leaned forward to hear, followed by a surge of emotion so powerful it felt like the air pressure in the room had changed. At the center table, the transformation was the most stark. The man's smile had vanished. The amused glint in his eye was gone, replaced by a blank, stunned confusion. He wasn't leaning back anymore. He was sitting rigidly forward, his elbows on the table, his forgotten whiskey glass casting a distorted shadow on the white cloth. His mouth was a tight line. He watched her hands, those waitress hands that had carried his plates, now flying over the keyboard with a speed and precision that made his head spin. He was a man who understood value, who could look at a building and quote its price per square foot, who could assess a person's net worth from their watch and their shoes. But this was a currency he didn't understand. This was something that couldn't be bought. It could only be earned with 10,000 hours of lonely practice, with a kind of devotion that was foreign to him. His associates were just as still. The woman who had been laughing silently now had her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide. One of the men had taken off his glasses and was cleaning them nervously, as if he couldn't trust what he was seeing. Throughout the restaurant, people were transfixed. An elderly couple near the front held hands on the tablecloth, their wrinkled fingers intertwined, both of them with tears tracking silently down their cheeks. The memory the music stirred in them was private, but the emotion was shared by everyone. A young man on a date forgot about his companion entirely, his gaze locked on the pianist, his food growing cold. The waitstaff had gathered in the shadowy doorway to the kitchen, a line of figures in white and black, their tired faces softened with awe. The manager stood off to the side, his handkerchief forgotten in his hand, his earlier panic replaced by a dawning, incredible hope. Elara was gone. She was in a practice room that smelled of dust and old wood, with snow falling softly outside a high window in a city far away. She was a girl again, with skinned knees and big dreams, her small hands struggling to span the octaves, her teacher's patient voice guiding her. She was playing for her father, whose eyes would crinkle at the corners with pride. She was playing for her mother, who would hum along from the kitchen. She was playing for the home that only existed in photographs and in the deep, aching place inside her chest. All of that history, all of that loss, all of that love, poured out through her fingers. The music wasn't just notes on a page anymore. It was a story of beauty that had been locked away, of a voice that had been forced into silence. Every mournful chord spoke of distance. Every soaring, hopeful run spoke of a spirit that couldn't be completely crushed. She reached the final section of the nocturne, a return to the main theme, but now layered with all the sorrow and wisdom of what had come before. It was quieter now, more introspective. The final notes were a series of single, perfectly spaced chords, descending like gentle footsteps walking away into the dark. They were played with such tenderness, such a delicate touch, that the sound seemed to hang in the air long after her hands had stilled. She lifted her fingers from the keys. The last vibration faded from the strings inside the great piano, leaving a silence that was deeper and more profound than any silence that had come before. It was a respectful, almost holy quiet. She placed her hands back in her lap. She took a slow, shaky breath, as if waking from a deep sleep. She was back in the Chateau Rouge. The lights were too bright. The smell of food and wine rushed back into her awareness, and she could feel, like a physical weight, the gaze of everyone in the room. For a long moment, nothing happened. No one moved. No one clapped. It was as if the audience was collectively holding its breath, unwilling to break the spell. Then, from the back of the room, A single person began to clap. It was the elderly man who had been holding his wife's hand. His applause was slow, deliberate, powerful. It was less a celebration and more an acknowledgement, a tribute. It was the spark. Another person joined, then another. A table erupted, then the whole restaurant. It wasn't wild, cheering applause. It was a rising, thunderous, standing ovation. Chairs scraped back as people got to their feet. The young man on his date was whistling. The kitchen staff in the doorway were clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. The manager was beaming, clapping with a look of utter, delirious relief and shock. Elara blinked, looking out at the sea of standing, applauding people. The sound was overwhelming, a wall of noise so different from the music. A flush crept up her neck. She hadn't expected this. She had only hoped not to fail, not to be fired. This reaction was terrifying. She gave a small, stiff nod, more of a bow of her head, and quickly stood up from the bench. Her legs felt weak. She didn't look at the center table. She couldn't. She just wanted to get away, to find a dark corner where she could breathe. She stepped away from the piano, intending to flee straight back to the kitchen. But she didn't make it. A figure stepped into her path. It was the owner of the restaurant, a silver-haired man in a beautifully tailored suit who dined at his own corner table most nights, observing everything with quiet eyes. She had never spoken to him. He was holding a small microphone, one usually used for the occasional birthday announcement. He smiled at her, a warm, genuine smile, and gently took her arm to stop her from running. He turned to face the still applauding room and raised the microphone. The sound system gave a faint squeal of feedback, and the clapping slowly subsided into an eager, buzzing quiet. Everyone wanted to know who she was. "My friends," the owner said, his voice calm and filled with emotion. "Thank you. And thank you to our astonishing, unexpected guest artist tonight." He glanced at Elara, who looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. "I have just had a very quick conversation with my manager," the owner continued, addressing the room, "and we have learned a little, just a little, about the remarkable young woman who has just shared her soul with us." He paused, letting the suspense build. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning. "Her name is Elara, and until tonight, she has worked for us as a waitress. But a long time ago, in another life, in another country, she was something else." He looked at her with deep respect. She was a child prodigy, a prize-winning concert pianist, performing on stages across Europe since she was 9 years old. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The man at the center table flinched as if he'd been slapped. The owner's face grew more solemn. The war in her homeland took that life from her. It took her home, her career, her safety. She arrived here a year ago, with nothing. She took this job not for passion, but for survival. Every tip, every paycheck, she sends back across the ocean. It goes to her family, who are scattered, displaced, living in a refugee camp. He let that hang in the air. The truth of it was like a cold, clear wave washing over the warm, rich atmosphere of the restaurant. The expensive wine, the fine steaks, the designer dresses, it all suddenly felt different. It felt heavy. She played tonight, the owner finished, his voice thick, not for applause, but because we needed help, and because, perhaps, for a few minutes, she needed to remember who she was. "Thank you, Elara." He handed her the microphone. She just stared at it, horrified, and shook her head. He understood, and simply lowered it. The silence returned, but now it was a silence of profound, humbled respect. People were looking at her not with curiosity, but with awe, and with a kind of shared sorrow. The standing ovation had ended, but no one sat down. They just stood there, looking at the woman in the simple black dress, and at the center table. The millionaire finally looked away from her. He stared down at his own hands, resting on the white tablecloth. They were the hands that had waved away sommeliers and signed big checks. They had never created anything of beauty. They had only ever acquired things. For the first time that anyone at his table could remember, he had nothing to say. The silence after the owner's words felt different. It wasn't the quiet of before the music, which had been full of chatter and clinking glass. It wasn't the sacred hush that had followed the final note. This was a heavy, thinking kind of quiet. People were absorbing the story, fitting the puzzle pieces together. The timid waitress, the public scolding, the breathtaking performance, the refugee camp. It was a lot to hold in a fancy dining room. Elara felt like a specimen under a glass. The owner's kind words were a blessing and a curse. They explained her, but they also exposed her completely, laying bare the private pain she carried on every tray. She gave the owner a small, desperate look. He seemed to understand and gently gestured towards the kitchen doors, offering an escape route. She took it, moving quickly, her head down, weaving through the tables where people still stood. She heard a few whispers, incredible, so tragic. I had no idea, but they felt like they were coming from far away. Her only goal was to get behind those swinging doors. As she passed the center table, she couldn't help it. Her eyes flicked up, just for a fraction of a second. The man was still sitting there, but the kingly posture was gone. He looked smaller, hunched into himself. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the melting ice in his whiskey glass, as if the answers to a very difficult question were hidden there. His friends were quiet, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to do or say. The evening's entertainment had taken a turn they were utterly unprepared for. Elara pushed through into the kitchen. The sudden blast of heat and noise was almost a relief. The staff, who had been watching from the doorway, now surrounded her. The normally gruff head chef put a hand on her shoulder. "Kid," he said, his voice rough. "That was." "I have no words." The other waitresses hugged her, their eyes bright. The busboy, who was maybe 19, just shook his head and said, "Ho." It was the perfect thing to say, but the moment couldn't last. The manager rushed in, his face a map of conflicting emotions: awe, panic, and a burning need to capitalize on the situation. "They're asking about you," he said to Elara, his voice a frantic whisper. "A woman at table 4 wants to buy you a drink. A man by the window asked if you take requests." "What do I tell them?" Elara shook her head, backing away towards the staff corridor. I need a minute, please. No drinks, no requests." "But the piano is just sitting there. The owner thinks we should know," she said, more firmly than she'd ever spoken to him. "I played. That was the deal. I need to change." She retreated to the small, sad bathroom and locked the door. Leaning against it, she finally let out the breath she felt she'd been holding for an hour. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror. The woman in the black dress looked pale, her eyes too bright. She changed back into her waitress uniform, the familiar fabric feeling like a disguise she was putting back on. But it felt different now. It didn't feel like a prison sentence. It felt like a choice, a temporary skin. She was still Elara who needed this job, but she was also, now, undeniably, Elara who could do that when she emerged. The manager had been waylaid by the owner. She could slip back into the dining room unseen. The atmosphere had shifted again. A low, respectful hum of conversation had returned, but the topics had changed. People were speaking in softer tones, about the music, about the story, about how it made them feel. The piano sat silent again, but it was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a monument to what had just happened. Elara went back to work. It was the only thing that felt normal. She cleared a few empty dessert plates from a table. As she was stacking them, she felt a presence behind her. A large, solid shadow fell across the tablecloth. She knew who it was before she turned around. It was him. He stood a few feet away, hands awkwardly at his sides. He had left his friends at the table. Up close, he looked older. The confident, crinkled lines around his eyes now just looked like wrinkles. The piercing blue gaze was unsure, avoiding hers for a moment before forcing itself to meet them. He cleared his throat, a low, rough sound. He began, then stopped. He seemed to be struggling with the words, as if he was speaking a language he rarely used. "I wanted to apologize." Elara just stood there, holding the stacked plates against her chest like a shield. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. He looked down at his expensive leather shoes, then back at her. "What I said earlier, it was cruel and ignorant." The words came out slowly, each one weighed. "I judged you. I judged the cover of a book without having any idea of the story inside." He gestured vaguely towards the piano, a helpless movement. "What you can do, what you are. It's humbling. I run companies. I build things, but I don't make anything like that. I don't think I ever could." He wasn't offering excuses. He wasn't blaming the whiskey or the stress of business. He was just stating a fact. He had been wrong, and profoundly so. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the beauty of her music and the harsh truth of her story. "Your family," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "The camp, is it? Are they safe?" It was the question that undid her. Everyone had been dazzled by the performance, moved by the tale of a prodigy, but he was the first to ask about the present reality, the daily fear. A sudden, unexpected heat stung the back of her eyes. She blinked rapidly, looking down at the plates. "They are alive," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That is the word we use. Not safe, alive." He nodded slowly, as if she had just taught him a very important, very sad distinction. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. For a ridiculous second, she thought he was going to pull out his wallet and offer her money, a tip for the performance, a final, transactional fix. But he didn't. He pulled out a simple, plain white business card. He held it out to her, not with a flourish, but with a kind of solemnity. "This has my direct number," he said. "Not my office, mine. I don't know what it's worth to you. Probably not much right now. But if there is anything that they need, medicine, papers, a lawyer, a plane ticket, you call that number. You tell the person who answers that you are the pianist from the restaurant. They will put you straight through to me." Elara looked at the card, then at his face. The offer was so specific, so unlike the vague "let me know if you need anything" people often gave. This was a man who solved problems with action and resources. He was offering his machinery, the very thing that had made him so powerful and so insulated, to fix a problem he now understood. She didn't take the card immediately. "Why'd?" she asked, the words simple and direct. He thought about it. "Because I was an idiot," he said finally. "And because your hands shouldn't be carrying plates. They should be doing ***. He nodded towards the piano again. "And because sending money to a camp is not a plan. It's a delay." Slowly, she put her tray down on the table and took the card. It was heavy, expensive stock. It had nothing on it but a name and a phone number in simple black type. "Thank you," she said. Not for the offer, but for the apology. He just nodded again, a sharp, almost military movement. Then, he did something that surprised her even more. He gave a small, stiff, but unmistakable bow. It wasn't deep or dramatic. It was a bow of respect, from one professional to another. From a man who dealt in brick and mortar to a woman who dealt in sound and soul. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his table. He didn't sit down. He said a few quiet words to his associates, threw a thick stack of cash on the table, far more than the bill required, and walked out of the restaurant. His exit was nothing like his entrance. It was quiet, sober, and left a thoughtful silence in its wake. Elara slipped the card into her apron pocket. It felt strange there, next to her order pad and wine key. The rest of the night passed in a surreal dream. Customers smiled at her with new warmth. Some tried to ask questions, but she politely deflected, saying she had work to do. The owner came by and told her she had a job for life, in whatever capacity she wanted. He offered her the weekend piano slot on the spot, for triple what the previous pianist made. She thanked him but asked for time to think. When her shift finally ended, she walked out the back door into the cool night air. The city sounds were a welcome noise. She walked to the bus stop, her body aching with a deep tiredness. But her mind was clearer than it had been in years. She thought about the card in her pocket. She thought about the fear in her mother's voice during their last, crackling phone call. She thought about the cold of the practice room from her childhood, and the unbelievable warmth of the standing ovation, for the first time in a very long time. The future in front of her wasn't a dark, narrow tunnel of just getting by. It was still unknown and scary, but it had a door in it now, and maybe, just maybe, a key. She got on the nearly empty bus, found a seat by the window, and leaned her forehead against the cool glass. She didn't smile, but the crushing weight of loneliness, the feeling of being a ghost in this new country, had lifted just a little. She had been seen, not as a victim or a prodigy, but as a whole person, and that changed everything. The week that followed was a strange, suspended time for Elara. She went to work at the Chateau Rouge, slipping back into her waitress uniform. The other staff treated her with a new, gentle reverence that she found almost as uncomfortable as the earlier ridicule. The manager tiptoed around her, his earlier threats forgotten. Diners would sometimes recognize her. "Aren't you the one who?" And she would give a small, polite smile and hurry away with their coffee pot. The business card felt like a live coal in her apron pocket. She took it out often, looking at the simple black numbers. She didn't call. Pride was part of it, but a bigger part was fear. Fear that the offer had been a moment of guilt, forgotten by the next morning. Fear that accepting help would weave her life into his. A man whose world felt alien and intimidating. Fear that even with his resources, some problems were too big, too tangled, to fix. But the memory of her mother's voice, thin with worry, pushed her. The news from back home was never good. The camp was overcrowded, winter was coming, and her younger brother had a cough that wouldn't go away. One evening, after her shift, alone in her tiny studio apartment with its view of a brick wall, she dialed the number. It rang once, yes, his voice. No secretary, no greeting. Just that one, expectant word, "It's the pianist." "From the restaurant," she said, her throat tight. There was a brief pause. "I've been waiting for your call," he said, his tone shifting, becoming focused. "Tell me what you need." She didn't ask for money. Instead, haltingly, she explained the situation. Her family, their names, their location in the sprawling refugee complex, her brother's cough. She spoke of the red tape, the endless waiting lists for resettlement, the feeling of helplessness. "Okay," he said when she finished. "Give me 72 hours. Don't call this number again. I will call you." The line went dead. Elara sat on the edge of her bed, the phone in her hand, wondering if she had just made a terrible mistake. He called back in 48. His voice was brisk, all business. "Medical records for your brother have been forwarded to a specialist clinic here. They're expecting him. Your family has been granted humanitarian visas. They fly into the city on Thursday. An apartment has been secured for them, furnished, for 6 months rent-free. A caseworker who speaks their language will meet them at the airport and help them with everything." Elara listened, stunned into silence. Into days, he had moved a mountain that had been immovable for over a year. I don't know how to," she stammered. "It's not a gift," he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's a correction. I misvalued something. Now I'm correcting the error. There is, however, a condition." Her heart sank. Here it was, the string attached. "The condition is that you play," he said. "Not here and there, seriously. I've spoken to the owner of the Chateau Rouge. You'll have the weekend slot. But that's a start, not an end. I've also made a call to the director of the city symphony. They are holding auditions for a guest soloist position next month. You will be there. My contribution will get you in the door. The rest is up to you and that talent of yours." He wasn't buying her family's safety in exchange for her performances. He was investing in the talent he had so publicly dismissed. He was, in his own blunt way, trying to put the world back into an order he now believed was right. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Her family arrived, thin, wide-eyed, and wrapped in donated coats. The reunion at the airport was a storm of tears and trembling hugs in a language no one else around them understood. Seeing her mother's face, the deep lines of fear softening just a little, was a relief so profound it felt like a physical pain lifting. She moved in with them in the small, clean apartment he had provided. It was crowded and loud and beautiful. She kept her job at the restaurant, but now the weekend piano sets were hers. The crowds were different. People came specifically to hear her, not just to dine. The tips left on the piano lid were generous, but she no longer needed them for survival. She saved every dollar, a fund for her family's future, and she practiced. For the first time in years, she practiced with purpose. The guest soloist spot was for a performance of Grieg's Piano Concerto, a monumental, stormy piece. She rented a practice room by the hour, losing herself in the fierce, beautiful struggle of the music. The fear was still there, the fear of failing, of proving her earlier critic right after all, but it was now a fuel, not a prison. The day of the symphony audition arrived. The hall was vast and empty, all dark red velvet and glowing wood. A stern-looking panel of 3 people sat in the middle of the empty seats. One of them was the director, a woman with sharp eyes and silver hair. Elara walked to the center of the stage, to the concert grand piano. It made the Steinway at the restaurant look like a toy. She saw him then. In the very back row of the shadowy hall, almost invisible, sat the large man. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a simple dark sweater. He gave no sign of recognition, just a slow, single nod. She played. She didn't just play the notes. She attacked the concerto. All the years of loss, the frustration of silence, the joy of reunion, the terror of the camp, the warmth of her mother's arms, she poured it all into the music. It was thunderous and delicate, furious and tender. When she finished, her hands shaking slightly above the keys, the silence in the hall was absolute. The director stood up. "Thank you," she said, her voice echoing. "We will be in touch." Elara walked off the stage, her legs wobbly. He was gone from the back row. She never mentioned seeing him, and he never asked about the audition. A week later, the call came. She had won the spot. The news was in the paper, a small column, former child prodigy, now local waitress, to solo with symphony. The story mentioned her journey, but not the man who had ridiculed her. That part of the tale remained private. The night of the concert arrived. The hall was packed, a sea of expectant faces. Her family sat in the front row, her mother clutching a handkerchief, her brother wearing a suit that was too big for him. In a box seat to the side, away from the spotlight, sat the man. He was alone. The orchestra played the introduction, a brooding, Nordic landscape of sound. Then, the conductor looked at her, and she began. It was the performance of her life. She and the orchestra were one creature, breathing together. The music soared and crashed, a story of struggle and triumph told without a single word. When the final, triumphant chords rang out, the audience erupted. The standing ovation was instant, a rolling wave of sound that hit the stage. Flowers were brought out. The conductor shook her hand, then gestured for her to take a solo bow. As she stood there, blinking in the bright lights, sweat on her forehead, she looked out. She saw her mother crying tears of pure joy. She saw her brother clapping so hard his hands were red. And she saw, in the box, the man. He was on his feet too, clapping, but his face was different from the others. There was no broad smile, no tears. There was a look of deep, quiet satisfaction. The look of an engineer who sees a bridge he helped design holding strong under its first load. He wasn't taking credit. He was witnessing a correction he had helped enable after the concert. In the chaotic backstage area of hugs and congratulations, a messenger found her. He handed her a simple, thick white envelope. Inside was no note, just two things. The first was a deed of trust. It was for a foundation, called the Second Movement Foundation. Its purpose was to provide grants, housing, and career support for refugee artists, musicians, painters, writers displaced by conflict. The founding donor was listed as an anonymous private trust. The board members included the symphony director, a famous novelist, and her own name, Ilara Rostova. The second item was a photograph. It was a small, slightly blurry picture, taken from a distance. It showed a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, with dark braids, sitting at an enormous piano, her feet dangling far from the pedals. She was looking at the camera with a serious, focused expression. On the